Today's topic is Tenancies Part 2. But first, let's do a quick review of what we talked about last time. We introduced the different types of tenancies. What is a tenancy? Tenancy is the options of holding estates. There are various types of tenancies, and tenancy in severalty is the most common, and that means sole ownership. Another type of ownership is concurrent ownership, and that is broken into tenants in common, joint tenants with the right of survivorship, community property, tenants by entirety, and tenants in partnership. In a concurrent ownership, co-owners can have two types of interests. The first is undivided interest in the property. That's where co-owners have the right to possess the entire property together. The second is the equal right of possession. It's also often called the unity of possession, which gives each co-owner the right to possess all or any part of the property. Next, we explained tenancy in common, which means that the tenancy belongs to two people, and they each hold an undivided interest, which can be passed to their heirs or devisees. Related to tenancy in common, there's a concept called the right of survivorship. In a joint tenancy, when one co-owner dies, the remaining co-owner can acquire the first person's interest. Tenancy in common is also quite flexible. The co-owners are allowed to acquire their interest at different times. They can also acquire them in various ways. For example, one can get it from a will and the other one can do it from a deed or a title transfer. And also, their interests do not have to be equal, as in they can have undivided interests, but they don't have to be equal. So now let's move on to part 2, starting with joint tenancy. That's where two people have equal ownership and undivided interest, and the right of survivorship. One restriction of this type of tenancy is the co-owners cannot will their portion to their heirs. To create a joint tenancy, there has to be 4 unities. Number 1, all tenants must have equal rights of possession. Number 2, they must have equal interests. Number 3, the title must be purchased at the same time. And number 4, the title must be acquired within the same deed or will. In short, the 4 unities of joint tenancy are possession, interest, time, and title. So what happens in the special occasion when one of the tenants uses his portion as a security for a loan? Unfortunately, the creditor can force the sale. But if the tenant dies before the loan is paid off, the surviving tenants have the right to receive his portion and get it for free, including free of encumbrance. Now onto community property. First of all, it's not very common. It only applies to 8 states right now: Washington, Idaho, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Texas, and Louisiana. Community property applies to married people, and they have to be acquired by either the industry or labor of one or both of the spouses. They cannot sell, convey, or encumber the community property without both spouses' signatures. Any of such properties that is purchased outside of the marriage is considered a separate property, so only one of the spouse's signature is on the deed. Now let's move on to tenancy by entirety. It doesn't apply to all states. It's a common law tenancy and is generally used by husband and wife. This type of tenancy provides security because it contains the right of survivorship. If one spouse dies, the other spouse automatically gets the ownership and is completely free of debt. Sounds like a very good deal, but of course there are some restrictions. The tenancy by entirety can be terminated in the following ways. Number 1, if one spouse gives the property to the other spouse as a gift. Number 2, very obvious, they get divorced. Number 3, they both pass away. And number 4, they sell it as a joint conveyance. Another type of tenancy is called the dower and courtesy, and it only applies to some states. It's another form of life estate, and it benefits a married couple. It exists to protect one of the spouses who does not own the property during marriage and does not have the support of the spouse who just passed away. For example, you marry someone who already owns the property. You move in, you live with the person, and they never will it to you. or sell it to you. And somehow you find yourself being a stay-at-home parent, so your spouse would have to support you. Unfortunately, your spouse dies. At this point, you can leverage dower and courtesy for protection. And you, the surviving spouse, is entitled to a 1/3 life estate in the property during your marriage. Dower is the right of the wife to a life estate, and courtesy is the right of the husband to life estate during a marriage. If, and this applies to courtesy only, the husband and wife have at least one child together. Now, relating to all these marriage rights, there's a term called inchoate, and it means an expected right to the estate upon the unfortunate event of one spouse's death. By the way, dower and courtesy does not apply to community estates, which makes sense because dower and courtesy is much more personal. There's also a term called the Uniform Probate Code, which gives the surviving spouse a certain share of the deceased spouse's estate. We're now done with part 2. In part 3, we're going to talk about some other types of ownership, including partnership, corporation, and limited liability, and also trusts. I hope you gained some valuable knowledge today. See you next time.